Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Really excited to be here. I'm Grace Macalino. I'm a director in the Health Sciences Life Science practice at Baker Tilly. And I'm here to talk to you a little bit today about leveraging RWE or real world evidence to gain coverage and secure reimbursement. Next slide. Unfortunately, my colleague David Gregory is not going to be able to be with us, so you guys just get me, but I promise it'll be a fun tour around real world evidence and the difference that it makes for securing coverage and working as in market access specifically. Next slide. So I'll give you a brief overview of the learning objectives. I won't read this specifically, but we are going to go over, where and how real world evidence, and talk a little bit about what real world evidence is, and how it can assist you in articulating a technology or a life sciences pharmaceutical company's value prop. We'll talk about really understanding the criteria and the things that payers and providers use to determine coverage in terms of whether a technology is going to be able to be covered or not, and how real world evidence can play a crucial role in meeting those standards and answering specific questions as far as practical utility. And then understanding when and how it's best to think about real world evidence during a product development life cycle. Next slide. So evidence is actually needed to satisfy a broad range of needs. I forgot to mention I'm an epidemiologist by training, so I'm always thinking from the perspective of evidence and data, and where and how can we use data to the best of our ability to answer important questions, right? Payers have specific important things that they like to know and understand. Providers have maybe different perspectives. Patients, scientists, other thought leaders in the field are really interested in knowing where and how is your product or your technology impacting or changing the field, or the current way the science is being conceived of, right? Regulatory bodies, associations, and by associations we mean OBGYN, societies, sort of groups that, where science, like lots and lots of scientists gather and really think about what are best practices. And then also, it's important to remember we're talking about patients, right? Patient advocacy groups. What's important to the patient might be very different from what a clinician or groups of scientists think, right? So making sure that we're always paying attention to what's important to the patient, and having the technology and pharmaceutical be patient-centric in everything that we do. Next slide. So this slide is actually purposely looks a bit confusing, right? There's lots and lots of goals and opportunities for having evidence answer questions, right? It could look at sort of understanding what is the current patient experience with his standard of care. What is that patient journey currently? What is the current economic burden? How is, accuracy of identification model? How easily are folks being able to be diagnosed or treated? Understanding patient engagement, sort of what does that look like, all the way to, what is quantifying the impact on clinical outcomes of your specific, agent or tool. And it can get very confusing. How do you turn that into actual studies, right? What are the kinds of studies that can answer the specific questions that you really would like to answer? And you can hear, so we've talked about lots of different stakeholders. We've talked about lots of different questions that you could answer, and then where and how do they align? And then on the right side, you see, there are specific types of study designs that you could come up with to answer different types of questions. For the purposes of this webinar, we really are going to focus on real world evidence, but it's important to get a context for the larger picture and where and how real world evidence fits in your evidence needs. Next slide. So we like to talk a lot about this sort of evidence generation funnel, right? And how we think about an evidence generation strategy really starts with understanding the landscape. And landscape could mean so many things and really includes a lot. What are the competitors in this space? What is the nature of the science? Is the literature mature enough that they understand a lot, and you really need to be thoughtful about how you're going to place the information you're now creating around your agent inside of the world of the existing science, right? Then stakeholder priorities. In that first slide, we talked about the different stakeholders, and because they might have different needs or want to answer different questions, it's important to understand whose stakeholder voice you really need to answer first, perhaps, or how to prioritize them, and really make sure you're sort of meeting the needs in the right way so that you're able to kind of move through that, product life cycle, right? And then ultimately, obviously, that has to be in the context of reality. What are the resources you have available to answer those types of questions in the form of studies or the different work you're able to do. Next slide. So, real world evidence, it has really become kind of a buzz term. At the most recent ISPOR conference, the International Society on Patient Outcomes Research, really talked about real world evidence really rising to the top of, what folks really want to know and understand. Over time, FDA has started to really embrace the use of real world data or information that's, were collected for other purposes, right? To create real world evidence, RWE. In addition to sort of your historical randomized controlled trial, right, as being your sort of gold standard. But the problem with randomized controlled trials is that's not reality, right? People that live and are enrolled in clinical trials, that's not how people engage with the healthcare system. It's not it's not real life, right? So the value and advantage of using real world evidence is really coming to the forefront. People are also really clear that now that we're getting more and more access to data on a daily, if not hourly basis, there's so much opportunity to really understand and unpackage what really is going on, right? There are lots and lots of data sources, whether it be claims data or, electronic medical records, as the hospitals and, providers slowly but surely get all that information available to folks. That rich, opportunity to really answer some important questions about what is the true patient experience? What does that look like, right? Payers are increasingly more and more wanting to understand, okay, well, tell me, do you understand what that looks like in the real world? Do you have real world evidence to answer the questions in terms of effectiveness or the value of a particular product? And then, additionally, 96% of providers indicate that they would be more likely to prescribe a product if they had both, right? Clinical trials are required to really answer the question in terms of if something is of value. But then, what does that look like? Give me a little bit more. Those clinical trials are more often than not no longer enough. Next slide. So there are some key considerations, right? I mentioned earlier that real world data are collected for the purposes of, not for research purposes, right? They're data that were collected for different reasons. And so it's important to understand there are advantages, disadvantages with every data set you choose, the questions you try to answer. You really do need to sort of put the study that you'd like to create in the context, as I'd mentioned earlier, of existing research. What have people already known about this? How many years of data are available in your data set, right? Obviously, if you have a new agent that's out there, you're wanting to do the best you can to answer questions that are timely. And, a lot of times payers will ask about hey, can you give me anything about long-term follow-up? So, really being thoughtful about collecting data as early as you can with a new product or a new agent is so very valuable, right? Because that long-term follow-up can only build once a product is out in the market. What patient, hospital, and provider level data are available. And again, I feel like that really is changing and evolving so quickly. So just kind of keeping in mind the value of these types of considerations for your real world data selection is so important. And then what is the economic impact of licensing a real world data set, right? Because if you are able to answer these questions, sometimes more often than not, accessing these real world data sets do come with a cost, but sort of what it can be gained from answering some of those unique questions with those data sets are so very valuable. Next slide. It's important also to bring up that there are challenges and limitations, right? And as I mentioned, real world data are collected not for the purposes of clinical research. So there are going to be limitations. You don't always know how those data were collected in the first place. There are going to be limitations in terms of the kinds of data you'll have access to, because you might be able to have access to a data set that can tell you a test was ordered, but you might not have the test result, right? So that's where it's really, you kind of have to be thoughtful about the limitations, what you can and can't do with real world data. There isn't existing infrastructure to sort of help storing and transferring real world data. So this is kind of like getting into a little bit in the weeds from the technical aspects of like how to conduct real world data analyses. I'd mentioned the cost earlier of licensing the data specifically, but really understanding, too, like what are the regulatory issues that you might have to navigate with accessing real world data and answering those questions from the jump. So even though you're using, it's like a secondary data analysis, just checking in with external review board is valuable, just really being thoughtful about, how best to conduct these studies compliantly. Next slide. So, we talked a lot about strategy, right? You will have to sort of slowly but surely get to specific studies, or ideally a study pipeline in terms of, okay, here are the next 5 studies that would be valuable to do to create real world evidence. It's important just briefly, kind of go over, there are different types of study designs possible. Different partnership opportunities. Are there folks that you can work with, or other groups? I didn't mention patient advocacy groups. Perhaps they have data that are real world data that could be used for real world evidence. Specific resource data details can include anything from not just how much money do you have, but how much time do you have to get these studies up and running, and kind of weighing all those things together. And then ultimately access to the data that, either you have or others might have, and how best to access that and what that looks like. So there's a lot on this slide, but I think this is really, really valuable to see that, there's so many real world solutions as well as outcomes that, come out of using real world data and HUR solutions. Anything from cost effectiveness, utility models, budget impact models. Really, you can hear we're starting to bring in, the cost, not just the effectiveness. But it's important because you always want to be making sure that you're focused on the right outcomes, depending on whose perspective is important. Whether it's the patient, sort of what's part of their diagnosis and treatment journey is really valuable, because the more payers can understand what a patient population has to go through, the more they're able to include it in their calculation of, what they need to be thinking about, right? The cost of the illness, due diligence assessment, basically, again, kind of understanding all the things that are possible. And lots of good outcomes come from real world evidence, right? Anything from supporting FDA regulatory applications, understanding more about your patient population to be able to answer some of those. We'll see sometimes folks will really use real world data concurrently with their clinical trials to answer questions about their patient populations. Identify competitor acquisition opportunities, right? For some, it might be valuable to really partner and explore what that kind of partnership could look like. Next slide. So we talked a lot about real world data. We talked about real world evidence. And now we're going to talk, to that sort of second half of what we wanted to share with you today about a market access strategy, right? Really, the key to long-term commercial success is making sure that you have a robust market access strategy, that you're thoughtful about, considering all these different things, improving patient treatment pathways, educating industry leaders. And we've definitely found that a good market access strategy can lead to almost a quarter incremental increase in revenue over a product life cycle, but also just the time to reimbursement and payer coverage. So we've really seen over time the difference that it makes to have some strategy around this, so that you're not having to kind of move forward, go back, stop, come back. And we'll talk a little bit about this in the next few slides. Next slide. So timing really is everything. The idea of integrating your market access strategy earlier is, we say is a good idea. Really integrating as well as coordinating that with your evidence generation strategy and outcomes, I think is super, super important, because with a delay, there's lots and lots. You don't want to wait until the end and go, oh man, I wish we had conducted or collected different variables, or that we, had, looked at longer follow-up, right? So those are the kind of issues where sort of integrating that perspective sooner rather than later, it can be so, so helpful. Next slide. So we talk about sort of 5 big steps in terms of market access strategy, right? Strategy development, really understanding, your product value, what is required to increase product access. As I mentioned before, doing that sort of landscape analysis is so valuable. What are the important clinical outcomes that you need to be considering and thinking about? We talked a lot about earlier, I said, real world evidence and HUR integration. How does that fit into your whole picture as you're putting this all together? It's as valuable, right, to effectively communicate about the evidence and really understand, based on your stakeholders, what's most not just understanding what's most valuable for them, but how best to present the information in a way that speaks to their listening, or what they're looking for, right? And so we talk a lot about that. In the next couple of slides, we're going to talk a lot about what that means uniquely for payers. And then market and coverage expansion, right? Ultimately, the goal here is to expand product coverage as well as increase utilization for, getting the right drug and med device to the right patient population at the right time, right? That's ultimately our goal in terms of being able to, make a difference and, get good science out there. So I'm going to pause for a little bit and talk a little bit about payer engagement, because I think that that's sort of, along the continuum, the next step in that strategy that I haven't spoken about yet, right? Payers are really interested in hearing about the product value. Tell me the cost of the medical treatment. What is this added burden to the system, or where are we saving money? Where and how is this impacting change to standard of care, right? Things to think about in terms of payer engagement, right? You can start to understand what are the payers' needs, and sort of it could be unique and different depending on the payers, the different payer groups, right? What is their current coverage for similar products or devices in the market? Like, how do they perceive or think about that? Maybe starting with smaller, more local payers to begin with, to just get a sense. Obviously, success builds upon success. So being able to, have those early wins is really important. And you can start to prove and show, like, hey, people are getting that this is important. Here's where and how, you can build that story. Putting together a payer-facing dossier is something that we really talk about as being really important, right? Again, framing, not, obviously, rigorously presenting the data in a way that is most valuable to the reader or listener is what we're talking about here, and making sure that you're aware of both, what are their perspectives and things that they're considering, and how best do you put that evidence in a particular light, right? And then truly understanding what the process is to incorporate in existing treatment guidelines, right? None of this is done in a vacuum. Everyone wants to know, how does that impact, existing practices, and making sure that you have, again, the perspectives of those that really are at the head of different guidelines or, associations and groups. Next slide. Okay, so we talk a lot about, just kind of want to summarize here, like what payers care about, right? Clinical efficacy. Obviously, they want to see that there's an improvement in patient outcomes. Ideally, you're reducing direct costs, or some kind of, quality stands for quality of adjusted life year gains, right? So it's a measure that has us understand what, it's like a surrogate measure where and how is this really making a difference for patient populations over time in terms of their lived lives, right? Reducing episode of care costs. Society guidelines, and that brings us back to sort of the association, kind of like where and how does it fit? And, does it fit into the current perspective of how the field is thinking about about a particular condition, so whether it be, sleep apnea, and what does the Sleep Association think about, if it's a diagnostic tool for STIs, how, what does, the American College of OBGYNs think about it, right? So those, including that in the conversation is really, really valuable, and, makes a difference to payers, right? The current use and approved statistics, sort of like, what is the convention, and making sure that you're using and thinking about how you constructed your analyses appropriately, right? That, people can get very creative with statistical analyses, but, folks on the payers are savvy. They really know what they would expect to see, kind of like what, is kind of convention, and where and how sort of things should, kind of go along with what everyone else is doing. I think is important. That's the point we're trying to make there, for sure. So there are some pitfalls of convenient evidence. I think it was important, like I talked a lot about all the things that folks are looking for, but just a little nod to, we've seen unfortunate issues where folks will come to us like, hey, can you help us get coverage? And, really, the challenges of, when this has sort of been done, conveniently, or without a strategy, right? You end up with poorly designed studies sometimes, right? A lack of an appropriate comparison group. People have a tough time trying to put together, like, why did you pick that group to compare to? You have a small sample size that either, isn't enough to power to show significance, or, there are some, Hayes assessment. There are some sort of assessment groups out there that have specific cutoffs in terms of, number of people in your study that they will not consider if it's not above 100, or so, again, kind of thinking, and if you have an awareness and you're able to plan for those things ahead of time, then you'll know to not stop your data collection, before you reach that 100 mark. Data collected at the wrong time points, right? If convention, people really think about, 30 days after surgery, 90, or, 60, whatever that is, you want to make sure that you're, again, using time points and endpoints that, make sense to folks, and that people, it makes sense. So all that said, it's not just that, you have poorly designed studies. You might also lack consistency across studies. If you have a lot of different studies with different endpoints, it gets a lot tougher to kind of put a story together with these many studies. No one study is going to answer the call in terms of, is this product effective? But ideally, you'd like to have consistent, reproducible, multiple studies saying the same thing with the right endpoints, right? In different study populations, different time points, sort of adding to your body of knowledge, as opposed to this, somewhat of a hodgepodge way that it could look if it isn't strategic, or if it's convenient. And then, unfortunately, in this way, you sort of lose the opportunity to build a reproducible body of evidence that really does show effectiveness, that it's compelling and tells a good story. So here's my last slide. I really just thought it was important to kind of bring it all together. There are unique market access factors for global success. I brought it kind of not just to market access, but let's talk globally, because, many of our clients do have a global presence, and it's important to consider, the field is highly competitive and rapidly evolving. As more and more data are available, you want to keep on top of your game to make sure that you're as thoughtful as others, with using existing data where possible. As I mentioned, the shift towards including real world data and including that as part of your story will be very valuable. Decision makers want to understand product outcomes in a real world setting. I think it's important to say, as we look to, expand to different countries, country-specific regulations, as well as data from specific countries, we're seeing more and more is being asked of folks. And so, where and how you can take advantage of real-world evidence, generation in unique countries, I think is going to be more and more a theme here. Competitive dynamics are playing a big role in reviewed decisions, and then ultimately just really thinking about that cost effectiveness as you consider the value of your product or medtech device. So that's it for me as far as our set slides. Just wanted to check if there are any questions. Let's see. Okay, no specific questions. Let's see. Oh, actually there are, sorry. Are there therapy-specific registries considered RWE? Not to date, actually. We have not found. A lot of companies or some patient organizations have put together registries that are available, and really understanding within your therapeutic area what those are valuable. We've definitely tapped into those and reached out to folks. Let's see, another question. What is the experience with the payers that ask for certain data after providing the required data? Yeah, so some person asked, if we have experience that sometimes you go to a payer and they ask for specific questions, and then you go back and, they ask for more arbitrary data or what seems arbitrary. Yeah, I mean, that definitely depends. It has happened, and you can't. I don't know if that's something you can necessarily predict. You can, the best you can do is to be as responsive as possible, and if they bring up something else, to be responsive to that as well. I do have to say that if you are going back to payers for a different coverage or indication, I guess a good point or something to think about is, that's kind of fair game for them to review everything all over again. So you really want to make sure that you're able to be thoughtful, responsive, just kind of have in the back of your mind, like, okay, where might they have other questions that they'd like to ask that you're able and prepared to respond to. So, all right, I think we're coming to time. Let's see. Can you speak to IRB requirements? No waiver of consent. Yeah, IRB requirements. Great question. A lot of times IRBs are really good about if you are using data that were collected for another reason, that could be considered, non-patient, what do they call it? Hold on. They call it non-human subjects research, right? And organizations or journals are caring more and more about that. You just got an IRB to nod that this isn't human subjects research, but that they verify that it's a good source for the data. It's kind of like a good sort of check mark that someone else has reviewed your study design. It's a good data source, and you can go from there. So that's what we're finding. People have asked us, like, is it a good idea to go to IRB, even if you are using secondary data? And in some instances, it makes a difference, especially for manuscript acceptance. So I think we're coming to time, but thank you all for your being here. And please feel free to reach out to us if you have any additional questions. And it's been great spending this time with you. Bye, everyone.